All right, today we are talking mostly about documentary and experimental films, and largely focusing on documentaries. We are going to look at the beginning a little bit of narrative style and film, because you have to have some concept of that to talk about the other. We're going to spend more time on narrative film and like plot, characters, etc., in a later lecture. So we're going to come back around to the narrative part, so that's why it's a little bit shorter on what we're talking about today. So let's look here on just introducing narrative and kind of what it is, so that we can get that kind of basis, because it really is central to any story. It's hard to it's hard to avoid a narrative. You can, once the experimental films often do, but it's still hard to do. So the official definition is narrative is the art of constructing a story from a sequence. And I know this is the official definition, or one of them, of fictional and non-fictional events. And there is different definitions, but this is one of the definitions of it. So this is the official one, right? The art of constructing a story from a sequence of fictional and non-fictional events. And the reality of this is that most films are narrative. Because again, one of the other definitions that we're talking about is it's a story, right? And it's important that even non-fiction films tells a story. And there's traditional narrative, and then there's non-traditional narrative as well. So we kind of look at that as and part of that is you can have it. It's hard not to tell a story unless you go out of your way to be completely random. You're going to have some kind of story. Now, there is a difference, though, between traditional narrative, which does, even though it can be nonfiction, narrative often is fiction-based. And we're going to look at what the difference is with, like documentaries are going to have some narrative to it, but it doesn't have the traditional narrative of a fictional story. And so that's what we're kind of going to focus on here for just a second. So a typical narrative film follows characters, like with the key idea are the main characters, right, that go through a series of events. And this usually includes conflict, because if you think about it, right, here, we can put this right here. One of the big aspects of that is conflict. You would have a really boring story if you don't have some kind of conflict. And there's been films that have tried to do that, where they it's like filming, trying to do a fictional movie, not like a documentary or nonfiction one, a fictional story that showcases basically the mundane, right? The day-to-day life of how we live, which is not, rife with massive conflict and adventure and tough decisions and fighting the bad guys, right? You're working, you're eating, you're taking care of kids, you're watching TV, you're playing video games, you're taking the dogs on a walk. None of that is overly thrilling. If you try to just then make this into where you wrote a fictional story about a character who just went about their daily life, if there's no conflict. And again, they've tried this, and it's basically produced a really boring movie, because that it takes away the tension, the suspense of what's going to happen when you remove the conflict from the narrative. So conflict is almost always central to that. And then if we look at like other like characteristics here, we'll say characteristics of a narrative, right? Or names for it. Well, one that we've been talking about, right, is it's a story. It's simple as that. It's a story. A narrative can be a type of movie, right? And a story kind of covers a larger books, movies, things like that. An oral tale that someone tells. It can be specifically a way of structuring fictionalized stories. And so what it means with this is it gives you have a specific order to it, right? That there is, usually when you follow a narrative, you follow this kind of pattern, right? And that usually has specific things to it, such as a plot, story order. You often have there's different types too. There's the 3 acts, which is again somewhat of story order. There's the hero's journey, and we're going to look at these in more detail later. I'm going to show you just something with this real quick, but we're going to get into it. We're going to actually talk more about these when we talk more about narrative. I just wanted to introduce them because it is part of this. So the idea is, right, that there's not one single structure to follow with a narrative, but there's all these different types. But the key is that a narrative often is what it does is it sets up, once you decide what type you want to do, how you're going to follow it. So if we look at, for example, here, this is the 3-act narrative. And it's the idea that every story can be broken into 3 parts. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, right, as it says here. But they've got it here, set up, confrontation, which this is the conflict, and then resolution. And that the Act 1 and Act 2 move the story to the zenith, though they say the climax, right? But it's the zenith of the story. And once you've reached that kind of final conflict and event, the rest is the what they call descending action here, and that's about the story wrapping up, essentially, or resolution, right? Where you have the end consequences of all the conflict and the whatever action being finished up. Characters examining what happened, and then the final kind of events and discussion about that, and then the conclusion. So like but the idea, the clear idea with 3-act structure is that the story's always building till the end of Act 2, and then Act 3 is always the decline. There's versions of this where like you'll have a decline in Act 3, and then essentially Act 3 will have another false rise, and then back to decline. So a false rise would be like what the bad guy dies, and they're resolving stuff, right? You think you won, and then all of a sudden it turns out he was not dead, and he tries to do one last fight, right? Where he comes back to life, or he wasn't really dead, but he comes back, it tries to stab out at the person, and then they shoot him again, and then he's dead. Right? That's a false rise in Act 3 that then continues its decline. But it's meant to, it's kind of a it's not a trick, but it certainly is. We have expectations. I think the 3-act structure comes from, and again, we're going to talk about all these more, but the 3-act structure comes from the idea that we have it, because stories are so often told in a certain way, we have an expectation of, the rise in action, and when you reach the zenith, then you have an expectation that the conclusion is where things get wrapped up. So to have that surprise jump scene, essentially, where all of a sudden the bad guy comes back and it looks like he might win, that subverts our expectations, even if we're just subconsciously thinking about it, that the story is wrapping up and it's done. And that's what causes the surprise and the excitement again real quick, and then the resolution. that's how that works with this one. And this is one of the arguments, is that, you know, almost all stories can be broken into this structure. Again, there's differences that definitely play into this. I think the traditional narrative tends to follow the 3-act structure, though. If you take a look and watch films with this in mind, right? So the next film, not documentary, but the next film we watch, that's a narrative film, take a look at basically, you know, how does it fit into Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3? And if it doesn't, where is it changed up? And there's some that don't, right? That definitely don't, because they intentionally subvert this. But if you're going into writing a story and you're not trying to do something different, this is almost always what you just end up producing, because it's what we've come to expect. Now, the other one is the hero's journey, and there's lots of different hero's journeys, like diagrams. This is just one. And I would argue, like, it doesn't always have to be supernatural aid, right? So they have some things here. It can be. It also is, when there's a call to adventure, you often have the reluctant or unwilling, we'll say unwilling hero. Okay, so they're reluctant, or they don't want to do it, right? It's like they're called to, you know, we need you, and I don't want to do that. No, I gave that up. And they're pushed into the event anyways, right? Which, so again, one of the ways is mentioned here, it could be supernatural. When we talk about the hero's journey in more detail, when we get into narrative discussion, and in one of the near future lectures, we'll talk about the different types of hero's journeys. I just picked one to showcase here, but it doesn't have to be supernatural. Like, it can just be that you have the unwilling hero, or it can have a supernatural thing that pushes them towards that threshold, as they call it, which is the beginning of transformation. Usually, if you're the unwilling hero, then you have some disastrous event, not supernatural, right, that pushes them to the threshold to agree. So, for example, Star Wars, Luke rejects Obi-Wan Kenobi's initial request to help, and he doesn't want to do it. And then he goes back to his home to find his aunt and uncle have been killed. That he's unwilling hero. He then has the disastrous event of his aunt and uncle being killed, which then pushes him into the threshold to accept and go with Obi-Wan Kenobi. So that's a very common one, but there are other versions of it, right? And then you have the conflict that takes place, and if you have the hero that, so like all of this kind of stuff here, they say it's challenges, right? Ooh. It changed the pen on me there for some reason. There we go. I was like, why is it so light? So you have the conflict and the what makes the action and everything like that that takes place. There's also usually something, and this is where they kind of talk about death and rebirth. It doesn't have to be literal, but the idea that there's something that the hero falters. They have a crisis of conscience. They make a bad decision. They do something wrong. They fail to save someone, right? And that, or you know, that Luke discovers later that his father is, you know, Darth Vader, and then he doesn't know his identity for, you know, a little bit. He goes into despair briefly. But from that, then they get past it. That's the key with a hero's journey. You always get past it, right? And then that's the death and rebirth. It doesn't have to be literal, but they get past that. Then you have the transformation. Atonement is that you make up for whatever early failings the hero had, and then, you know, they return and it concludes. So these two things often go hand in hand, right? The 3-act structure often has a hero's journey in it, and it's very, very common. it's probably one of the most common motifs in stories. Again, it doesn't have to be. There's plenty of films that intentionally subvert this, but in general, if someone is not actively trying to avoid these structures, that's what they get. Okay, so those are those two, and again, we'll come back and we're going to look at this in more detail later. And then we're going to put one more here, which is that basically anytime a story is chosen and organized, it has elements of narrative. So like when, let's say, moving on here, a story is intentionally structured or created, right? That is when it's going to have the elements of narrative. Versus if you just started having someone, I don't know, randomly talk, and so they don't have an actual like story that was established. It's just, you know, random discussion. All right, so now we're going to look at the types of movies, which still goes into narrative first, right? We had to give a little bit of just general narrative structure. The first type of movie, though, is the narrative movie. And again, we're not going to spend too much time on this because it's basically connected to what we were just talking about, but, you know, you still can't ignore that it's there, and it goes into other stuff that way. As we talked about, most films actually fall into this category, and how they're defined more is that you have genres, right? So that's a Western, we'll say genre films here, Western, romance, sci-fi, action, etc., musicals. But all of these different genres are still the subset of the narrative film. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next lecture, is the genres and the different types of genres in films and how they developed. The key aspects of narrative movies and stuff like that is, and in fact, the way that you know most films are narrative films is that we have like documentary, experimental films. We have a few titles that are not under the narrative structure, but that's the a minority, right? There's not a lot of other things. Like there's all these genres, but all the genres of film fall under narrative film. It's a very small subset of, like with the documentaries, with the experimental films, that are outside of that structure. So films can, one of the things we did already mention, right, is that it is often fiction, but it doesn't have to be. You can have films based on, we should put based on, because that's how they always say it, right? Based on a true story. Now, one of the things that you could take from this right away is based on usually means it's not fully 100% true, right? It got the Hollywood treatment. They took elements of a true story and then spiced it up for film. But even if it's based on a true story, right, you still have the narrative structure, because the story is arranged and created with a specific purpose in mind. Right? They didn't, if they are just documenting an event, that's going to be a documentary, most likely. But when you have the movies that are based on a true story, those are adaptations of factual events. And so with this, of course, you often have events are added or removed, right? Because there could be boring parts to the true story where they're like, well, we don't want to include that. That's really unnecessary. It doesn't provide anything to the overall story and feel, so we're just going to ignore that. And then let's add this event happening because that, might have happened, and it spruces it up and makes it more interesting within that. And the other thing that they often do with based on a true story is that the characters in it are a composite of people, which means that sometimes they'll have like the main character is just that person, but then like their good friend, right? That's the sidekick in the story, isn't based on one individual, but actually mixing together of several different people's personalities from real life. And they, instead of introducing three friends, right, that have those, you just combined all of those three friends into one character. And it often provides the same result as if you had put the three people together, but it's less complicated. And they do this a lot based on true stories. And then of course you've got the fact that there are actors, chosen to appeal to the viewers. They often are better looking than the people in real life because they're actors. People who are popular for that, they'll pick for these things. And of course, then actors, they have a screenplay. They have their lines that they have to memorize. Right? It's just not a documentary. It's not just going and recording the actual people with and filming what happened with them and catching that event on camera. It's recreating something that was a true event, but that's usually a lot of manipulation in between. So you should always just assume that if it says based on a true story, that there's parts of it came from a true story, but how much was changed totally depends on the film itself. Some maybe not very much, others quite a bit. And unless you go and research like the actual story, you're not going to necessarily know how much was changed at that. Now, typical narrative films have some characteristics besides what we have already mentioned. One is going to be, of course, the screenplay. And obviously, why we bring this up is because that'll be one thing that the documentaries often don't have. You have the character's behavior and spoken lines are already predetermined, right? So they're not making stuff up, ad-libbing. Although there are movies that is a characteristic they do. They give them a general topic, and then they just come up with what they're supposed to say. They have best in show. They have mockumentaries they're not documentaries, but they're essentially pretending they're documentaries. And a good one that shows actually that, where you, in order to try to make it look like a documentary, even though it's completely fictional, Best in Show gave general direction to the actors, but didn't give them specific lines. And so they then just wing it. And you can tell some of the time when they're saying their lines, when it gets this kind of awkward silence, or they say something really kind of random and it doesn't flow. And the idea is that it makes it appear more realistic, like something that actually happens in real life, because they're coming up with something, they're not memorizing a line with it. And the mockumentaries aren't really meant to like mock documentaries, but that they're these fake documentaries that are meant to look like they are actually documentaries. If you have not seen Best in Show, it's really good. And so that's a different version of it, right? And those ones still have narrative in them, but it's looser narrative, where you have the general outline, and then the actors are kind of coming up with stuff on their own, and that narrative isn't predetermined in that sense. But for the typical narrative films, you have the screenplay, you have the behavior and lines are predetermined, and of course the characters are played by actors. Versus in documentaries, it's you're interviewing real people, you're filming events, locations, people as things are happening, right? They're not actors. Or for a lot of the documentary, they're not actors. And we'll talk about the differences there too. And then there's the general technical aspects that are common with this, and that includes, of course, lighting, the studio, filming, soundstage, use of soundstage for creating the sounds you want, having different locations and modified sets so that you go film on a certain location to make it look like that. So that's the main things for what we're going to talk about with narrative. All right, so that's that. Again, we're going to do way more of a deep dive with narrative and like plot, character, hero, and all these other things that are components of it when we get to that topic. Okay, so the next one then is documentary movies. And the kind of structure and characteristic of this. So one of the big things that hopefully you got through with the narrative was the idea, right, that it's often fictional and it's these established characters, actors playing characters, whereas documentary films look to present or represent lived experiences. So the idea is meant to show, we'll say that, show lived experiences. Or recreate it, they can do that sometimes too, right? Is focusing on real people and real events, right? And then there's kind of two ways to, so how do you distinguish, it's obvious, it's like a superhero one, it's fictional, but some of the aspects are kind of, how do you distinguish between realistic and fiction? Well, generally it's how it's defined to the audience and how the audience, what their expectation was. I mean, it's one of the things that made the Blair Witch Project so successful is it was presented as almost a documentary. And the audience came into watching that film believing that it was real. And so there was a lot more investment in it in that sense, right? So that plays a role in that. Okay, so besides real events, real people, right, of course, documentaries identify themselves as nonfiction. That's the idea. Now, one of the things that goes with this, because they identify themselves this way, they also tend to establish this idea that they're factual and trustworthy. However, you can't always trust that is necessarily true, because there are documentaries that with good intentions are trying to showcase what's happening, and yet at the same time, they're still only showing it from one perspective, or maybe a couple different perspectives, but like you can't escape the filmmaker who has a goal, a reason for making this documentary, and that's going to come forth, that. But it gets into the whole philosophical aspect of it. Can anything be fully factual and trustworthy? Certainly when you have, we're going to look at the different types of documentaries and stuff here. There's ones that are based on it being informative and bringing in experts and basically teaching information, and those tend to be more factual and trustworthy. But you have other ones that are meant to tell a narrative, that are meant to push against social injustice, and that kind of goes off in a different direction, even if they're still presenting themselves as factual and trustworthy. Because the reality is, most people, when you hear documentary, you assume that then that's factual events and information, that's going to just be shown to us. But there is a lot that goes on behind that. But the key with any of this is that even though it's a documentary and we're presented with this idea of its actual people, it's real, it can be factual and stuff like that, most documentaries still have what you could call like the basic ingredients of narrative film. Because again, it's still a story, right? You can't get away from that aspect of it, of having a story. Now, what they don't tend to follow is the formulas that genre film does, but they're still telling a story. Because, I mean, this is, if you have a story and you're telling a story, even if you're trying to show it as accurately and truthful as possible to what happened, you still have to edit that together in a narrative that tells that story that happened, it took place. And in order for that to make sense to people, it has to tend to follow that kind of 3-act structure to make it interesting enough to want to watch, and as well as you know, share what your point that you wanted to make about why you bothered to film this documentary in the first place. So all of that is there, and then basically the idea is that the audience is left to interpret how factual and trustworthy, you know, the narrator, the filmmaker is in all of this. Okay, so let's see, we're in C here. I'm going to do types of documentaries. And there's a lot of different types that come into play here. One of the earliest is the ethnographic, or what really becomes the travelogue is kind of where it moves. Ethnographic, or let's say travel log film. These were done very, very early on. Like pretty much once there was film, people were interested in filming in other places, right? We'll get really specific there. A lot of the times it would be, you know, what foreign land from where the filmmaker is from, right? And they're bringing it back to show to people from where they're from. But it really is literally just filming in other places. And why this was so popular, and this is, you know, this is during the silent film era and even before early film, right? So think early film through the silent film era, these were super popular. And it's because people wanted to experience these new places. And for many of the people, right, we are very lucky that we're able to travel relatively cheaply and quickly, right? Back in the day, it was expensive to travel and it was slow. Many people were never going to be able to see faraway places and experience other cultures. And these ethnographic and travelogue films allowed them to experience that. It opened up the world, essentially, for people to be able to see other peoples and different events and locations and things like that. And so, like I said, these were super, super popular. One of the best known is by Robert Flattery. Let's put this here. And there we go. Make sure we get his name right. And he did Nanook of the North, and it's a silent film. This one, he definitely had like a kind of romanticized view of I don't know if it's the past as much as like anti-technology, like get out of the modern world. It's kind of Rousseauian, the idea of Rousseau's ideal of being out in nature and being away from technology and the crazy of the city, and that's where you can, you know, really appreciate life and understand yourself. And he very much followed that idea. And so he was very much drawn to filming people that were uncorrupted by modern technology and the modern world. And he ends up, he lived with them for over a year to get to know them, get to know their culture, and just fully experience kind of what life was like, everyday life, right? The idea that you couldn't understand everyday life unless you actually lived it in that process. And then it was very much romanticized. Oops. And there is, and while it does show, right, the whole point of this was to show how this group of people lived without modern technology. He definitely had them, they had some technology that they used in tandem with some of the older traditions, and he basically just filmed the older tradition stuff and didn't film when they used other stuff. He also very much, he set up scenes and events. So like he would have them be like, okay, you're gonna go hunting today. He didn't just let it happen. He'd have them like reshoot certain scenes. So that while they were still doing what they did every day, it's kind of like reality TV, where like you follow people around today with reality TV, and these things are happening, but they also set up a lot of the scenes and or have them, ooh, that line came off weird, let's reshoot that, you know, or ooh, that was a good thing we missed, let's reshoot that. Well, that's what he was kind of doing here. So let's look go here. Here's from the travelogue. So this is one of the travelogue films that showed St. Petersburg. And you have one from New York, right? And again, the travelogue didn't have to be foreign to the United States. It could be the United States to other countries. It could also just be people who didn't live in New York, right? And didn't ever see New York. Well, New York looks a whole lot different than somewhere in the Midwest. And so this still brought you to getting to experience a location you otherwise wouldn't go. So here's Nanook of the North, right? A story of life and love in the actual Arctic. The actual Arctic is like this true story kind of thing. And here we can see, again, oh, and there is a difference, right? These travelogues with the early films were literally just filming, it's like setting up a camera on the street and filming whatever happened, which was very much the characteristics of early film, right? Where they just filmed, they didn't set it up, they didn't create a scene, they didn't direct people, they just plopped the camera down and filmed what happened. And those travelogues were super popular as well, because again, it just gave you a realistic view of daily life. But Nanook of the North is also a travelogue, but it's a documentary that has the narrative component to it. So that's the difference, right? Those early ones I just showed you of St. Petersburg and New York, those didn't have a narrative. It literally was just whatever was happening. But Nanook of the North had a narrative that he set up to try to not only romanticize their life, but showcase this connection to nature and how they were connected with nature, and how that they lived successfully because of that. So you'd have these hunting scenes that they would film. One, he would just go out with them multiple times as they filmed, but he'd also have them pose and go to certain places that he wanted them to start with, because it got at the scene that he wanted to see, right? So it's like, okay, oh, you're there with your kid, go here, let me get this shot, and then you can continue on and do what you were doing, right? Or go stand up on that ice ridge first before you start hunting and look out at the ocean and be contemplative about it, and then you can come down and hunt, right? So that you have that set up because it helped create that. So let's take a look at a clip. We're not going to look at the whole film. You can view it on, because it's over an hour, on YouTube. But I'm just going to show the first little bit here. This introduction that he establishes is kind of meant to legitimize that this is right, this is real, true life, right? He's like, I don't have any film experience. These were just things that I filmed while I was doing other things, right? And these events happen. That was meant to say, like I didn't just make this up, right? I didn't just have this film. This was something that actually took place, as well as just this experience, which he was very much impacted by, because so much of his life was put into this. All right, I wanted to show some of this because it shares that, but let's skip ahead just for time. If it works. Oh, now it's freezing. It doesn't like when I skip ahead when I'm recording. All right, hang on. All right, let's see if this is enough. Oh, it was a minute ago. There we go. Okay. So they got them all inside the canoe here. Oh no, I didn't wait long enough. I had these up for a while so that it would be, ideally it would be good to go. But here, yeah, they keep pulling people out of the canoe. They're like way in there. The dog's like, what just happened? So much not luck with YouTube working when recording, because again, it was working just fine before I started. Get it. I can see the line a little bit ahead. Well, it's probably not gonna want to work here. That's fine. We gotta see just a little bit of it, and I'll talk for just a second and see if it comes back on with it. But if I don't have this one up, I'll make sure to put the link for it, and you can watch it. I mean, it is very interesting looking at, how they lived, and scenes from daily life, which was, ultimately his goal. Let me just clear that one out because I feel like it's going to just freeze there. Okay, so that's that one. You have the non-established, non-directed travelogues, and then you had like Nanook of the North, which was very much directed, even though it looks like he's just filming things that are happening. They definitely were planning these things out. Now, again, there's still things they did with their life, but it had direction to it. So that's kind of the difference. So the next one then is propaganda film. Now, propaganda documentaries specifically, because you can have propaganda narratives as well. Well, here, I'm going to stay film because they're all documentaries. Otherwise, I'm going to be writing documentary on every single one. But again, you can have like fictional propaganda films. We're looking specifically at the documentary aspect of it. So with propaganda, this is connected to that it's most of the time it is created for governments. There's small cases where it's not, but it's often created for governments to promote a specific political agenda. That's the goal of these, is to, I would also say, the idea is to persuade people, to the government's point of view. That's probably the best way of putting that. Now, what is often connected to this is that a lot of times when people hear propaganda, they immediately think that it's meant to trick or mislead. And the reason for that is because sometimes it is. that is sometimes the case, is to warp whatever events are happening in the favor of the government, right? That definitely is some of propaganda films. But it doesn't always have to be, right? It can be based on factual events that are meant to just showcase what's going on with society. So, for example, during the New Deal in the United States, the government paid for basically the specific works project for artists that included filmmakers, photographers, and things like that. And then they wanted them to go out and record what life was like in the Depression. Well, technically those could be seen as propaganda films, but they weren't ever, the government didn't have like a lot of authority in constructing it, right? They paid for it but this is part of it, right? Is that it's paid for by the government. They paid for it. They wanted the filmmakers and photographers to do this, but it didn't. There wasn't a specific political message that they were trying to, that they said the filmmakers had to create, right? It was go and show. Now, I mean, the goal was, to showcase life during the Depression, and ideally what they did hope is that eventually it would showcase life recovering from the Depression. So they still, had a goal, but it wasn't ever like, this is what you have to show. But there can be propaganda films, and there definitely are a ton of those, where that's what the government says. We're going to pay for this, you're going to create this, and we expect this to show this view of us. And you don't have a choice outside of that. Well, then it is meant to trick or mislead, or at least, showcase the best part of someone or some government and ignore all the bad things of that government. So it can go either way. But again, the main goal is to persuade and provide some kind of political message, is kind of the goal of propaganda films. Now, there's this good examples between actually the United States and Germany during World War II. So we could put, with World War II and the outbreak of World War II, you had two different countries create propaganda films with different directions, and it is important that one still is looked on, if nothing else, maybe not favorably, but with interest at how the government structured this. And then, of course, the Nazi propaganda film is looked on in a much more negative light, both because they were the losers of the war, and also because, of course, the horrible aspect of the Holocaust and the atrocities that were committed. It puts to light this film idealizing and idolizing Hitler and that situation, and so it comes off as way worse and horrible because of that. But I think it is important when we're looking at historical documentaries that sometimes that's shaped by who the victor of an event was, if it's based on war, and the perspective that you're going to get. But with, of course, with World War II and Hitler, it's a lot more clear cut. The distinguishing difference of a political propaganda film and what they were trying to do was also slightly different, and yet had similar aspects as well. So we're going to look at those two. So of course the first is after the United States, we'll say after Pearl Harbor, the United States had an issue, which was that they had run on President Roosevelt had run on the platform of isolationism, which was basically the idea that the United States, we're over here, Europe's over there, not our business, right? Not our problem. That's all that's going on there. That's Europe's issue. That's not ours, and we don't want to get involved. Even though we were involved in other ways, we didn't want to get involved in that. It was very much this us versus them, and trying to stay isolated. The big ocean separates us. We want to stay isolated over here. But now you have a problem because there were Pearl Harbor is attacked, and so you end up declaring war against Japan. And before we even declare war against Germany, which they were in discussions of like, do we probably have to declare war against Germany too? Hitler declared war against us, so it became a moot point. So we're at war now. How do you convince? And this happened in World War I too, by the way. How do you convince the populace to support the war? And understand why, we're changing our view from isolation to support. So the whole point was, or the goal, right, was to explain and convince, first and foremost, as the newly enlisted soldiers and military, and then American general civilians, or American citizens, we'll just say, right? That what they're supposed to do is explain and convince why we're fighting, which is what the title was, why we are fighting. Basically, why are we going to war after claiming we were going to stay out of it, that it wasn't it's why we fight is the actual title here. So here, I'll put the correct, why we fight is the full title of that. But that's what they were trying to convince people, is like, look, now we have to try to convince people that there's a reason we're fighting, even though we said we were going to be isolationists and stuff like that. And to educate the military, to get them on board so that people weren't pushing back and being like, well, we think this is wrong. And instead make sure that the public knew all the kind of consequence of why we needed to get into the war after this point. With this, they used lots of techniques that are still used today. And documentaries still used today to convince and highlight the reasons for it. They did it. It was in a series, so it wasn't one documentary. It was actually a series of documentaries, films that they showcased. So some of the things that they used were maps, charts. They used it's called the Voice of God Narrator, which is just a disembodied voice that seems kind of omniscient, all-knowing, sharing the information. Morgan Freeman is, and I have a picture of him, and he's the best narrator as the voice of God. And again, it doesn't mean that literally the voice of God, but the idea is, right, it's just this disembodied voice narrating events as if they know everything and understand everything. They had talking head segments, which were like experts and stuff like that, right? That would share their expert opinion on the situation, like, hey, this is why we are here today. And then you had film clips of things that were happening in the war, of Pearl Harbor, of raids in England. All of this was meant to convince people it was two parts: to convince people to support the war, and also to have people understand why the United States was going to war. So let's look at that here. You have the OWI is the one that was, oh, you can put that in here too. I always put it over here because this is an important department. The OWI is the Office of War Information, and they're like the CPI of World War II. In that they're the ones that produce like all of the propaganda and stuff for World War II. So this was the signage for the OWI. And again, if there was propaganda, whether it was posters, photography, pamphlets, film, the OWI created it. Here's an example of the posters. Right, the less said, the less dead. The big thing is, and this was learned in World War I, emotions. How to connect it to this emotional concept so that you feel guilty if you aren't falling in line, right? There was another one I didn't put in, but it's like a poster of a guy in the ocean, suggesting that like a ship has sunk, and he's pointing directly, so it looks like he's pointing at you when you're looking at the poster, and it says someone talked. So again, that kind of emotional aspect of feeling as though you are obligated to do what it suggests, because if I talk, I'm going to kill soldiers and stuff, and they play on that emotion. The documentaries are meant to do that as well, and they learned from World War I how to do this really effectively. So this is a Why We Fight, and again, a series of 7 information films. That's what it was. So you had one on the Battle of Russia. You had it on War Comes to America. They had another one that I'll show you a clip on, assuming it doesn't freeze up, the Prelude Tour. That was looking at some of the, what led to the war, right? Because again, these were not meant to just convince people that you need to support the war, which was part of it, but they were trying to explain and make sure that everyone knew why we were fighting. And that's why they have this first one, which is the Prelude Tour. So let's see if we can get this one up here. Oh no, that's not a good sign. We'll see. All right, let's try. I'm afraid to skip ahead. This first part is, of course, there's the Office of War Information. But if I skip ahead, it's going to freeze probably. So we'll just go through all the titles. That was one of the things with older films. They often had all the information before the movie started. And here's just explaining what it is that we're going to watch. Then they're actually explaining where they got the materials, where the film clips are from, and that they have reenactments or recreations. And then, I mean, it is important too, they say, right, but the goal is to give factual information. So they're trying to predetermine and establish that this isn't made up, this isn't a narrative, this is events that actually took place, and are factual events. Right, they're trying to create the legitimacy.
Causes and events leading up to our entry into the war. Well, what are the causes? Why are we Americans on the march? Is it because of that why we are fighting? Or is it because of Britain? France. China. Czechoslovakia. Norway. Poland.
All right, we're gonna stop there. So what they're trying to do just with that scene is a kind of shock and awe, right? Look at all the destruction. You know, why you're asking why we're fighting? Look at all these locations that are being bombed and destroyed by the Nazis, right? We have to, I mean, you have China, which was with Japan, but they kind of mix it all in together there, right? We have to fight this, because look at it's meant to shock and like, oh my gosh, look at how everything is being destroyed. We need to make sense why we're getting involved. Look at all the death, the destruction. It was intentional to start the film with all of that, like just bomb after bomb and destruction after destruction, right? And that propaganda film can be very clever, because they very much are trying to persuade and convince people of something that's to their specific goal. And you don't have that happen if you aren't being clever with how you produce the film in this case, right? Now you have the Nazi era film, The Triumph of the Will. All right, and this is, again, this was the Nazi propaganda. And again, what we're comparing and contrasting, because these were very similar, right? It was paid for by the government, and it was meant. Now, the Why We Fight was meant to explain and show why we're getting into war. This one was not meant to convince people of why they were in war. It was meant to show support for the nation's ruling party, which at this time was then Hitler and the Nazi Party. And it was definitely meant to glorify pen here. There you go. Hitler. One of the things that you have with fascism and authoritarian leaders is you get this cult leader style, where everything's kind of centered around that person, and you have lots and lots of different propaganda and stuff like that. And so, you know, Hitler was that cult of personality, and that is showcased in this film, in that sense, and why there's an emphasis on glorifying Hitler, because of that cult leader kind of status. But it was meant to make the Nazis and Hitler look good. And they said also like to showcase German pride, essentially. And so this was filmed in 1934 at a Nazi rally. And again, it was meant to showcase this up here, flattering images of Hitler. Like, the goal was not only to make him look good, but show like everyone kind of fawning over him. Look how the country is unified in support of Nazis and Hitler. the German people all support him. Look at how everyone is following that, right? So again, you have, and here's some images from it, right? This shot of, right, so that this is intentional, right? Your perspective is looking up, and this is very much that cult leader, cult of personality propaganda here. He looks larger than life because of the perspective, and is almost meant to look kind of like a deity. You have the background that's all just the sky, and it's meant to every image of like him and Mussolini and Stalin were constructed. The way they stood, the angles the pictures were taken of, what they were wearing, the uniform was part of that cult of personality and cult leadership thing, to make them appear strong, determined, godlike. Essentially, like for example, Stalin had his image projected with light in the sky. That's that godlike image as well, right? So the film does this too with this angle. Here you have the rally, and again, the sheer size, the importance of size and numbers was super important, because the idea was that it showcases, look at how unified, look at how everyone, all Germans are supporting the Nazis and Hitler. And then any aspect of the government, like this idea of the light coming off of it and that kind of halo effect of like God's grace shining over the government, it is in Hitler specifically, but this is the government in session and stuff like that. They were all carefully orchestrated and established to highlight that idea. Again, both were wartime propaganda films. Obviously, this one is seen as a lot more grotesque because of who the Nazi Party was and what they were doing and how bad Hitler was. But that both governments were paying to have these films made to try to support their cause. However, again, there are some differences, because the United States one does come off as more educational based documentary, even though they're still doing the shock and awe of some of that and whatnot, and they are trying to make the military look good. Whereas the Triumph of the Will is really just meant to glorify. That was the whole point. Make us look good and glorify us and show how everything is this unified system and how great it is, that people will be proud that they're part of this, or people won't be able to resist being part of this because they'll see this film and realize how amazing Hitler is and how amazing the government is, and they'll want to support that, right? So that direction goes differently. But then if you look at, like, of course, then how it's viewed in history today, right? You have the American propaganda film has looked more on with interest of, like, look at what the government did during this period and how they did that and why, versus, oh, look at these horrible films from supporting the Nazi Party. And that isn't just because of being victors, it is because of what Hitler and the Nazi Party did and how horrible it was. But it still definitely plays into that, and showcases the different ways that governments can produce those wartime propaganda posters. And Stalin did it too. Mussolini did it as well. Britain did it. Pretty much every government does this because they need the support of the people. You know, when you go to war, you need the support of the people. And if you don't have it, it's going to be difficult to be successful with that. All right, we are on number 3. So the next type is instructional films. And these are basically what it says, which the goal is to educate. Right? It can be basic skills that can be taught. Basically, anytime you go to YouTube now and Google how to do something, that's an instructional film. How to, right? That's what these were. That's what it is. The goal is it's more about common interest in education on a topic than trying to persuade anyone to accept that skill or that activity, right? That's not the attempt. It's the assumption is that you're already interested in this topic and you're gonna provide information, factual information, or at least, you know, information that someone's interested in and stuff like that, about a topic. But the main goal is to teach, right? To provide instruction on how to do something, on an event, on whatever the person is interested in. So, or not interested in, that they're forcing on the children. Here's an example from the 50s. 50s and 60s did these. This one, mind your manners, and then improve your personality. Right? They Cornet Instructional Films. I mean, they even, this one's the GIF here. The instructional film, right? They even label it as such. And they did a whole series on this. There's ones about being popular too, and how to behave in school, and how to treat adults. And they played these for the kids. And you could argue that this is a form of propaganda in trying to establish proper behavior according to, you know, whoever's making these. But it still was this idea of showcasing, here's how you have proper manners. And they walked and showed how girls and boys would have what was considered at the time proper manners. You know, how to improve your personality, how to be popular. These were how-to videos from the 50s and 60s. And again, the best example of this is documentaries today. Not documentaries, say YouTube videos today of any of the how-to, when you look up when you're trying to figure out how to do something. How to replace a door or whatever else, right? The next type then is persuasive films. And like it says in the name, the goal of these is to persuade viewers on a specific topic or event. And usually these were directly connected to what was perceived as some social injustice. Right? That they're trying to, doesn't like I keep touching the outside of the screen there. The goal is usually that they want to produce change. Right? So they're hoping that there is going to be some kind of action that takes place from this. One of the best examples of this where it is successful is the documentary film Blackfish, which was about SeaWorld and keeping orcas in captivity. And how it was detrimental to them, how it was dangerous to the trainers, and it had massive success in and pushback against SeaWorld and other, it wasn't just SeaWorld, but in other places that kept orcas in captivity, and pushing them to be released and getting them released and having people attendance at these parks go way, way down. And that was the goal of this documentary, right? One of the things that is part of this then that you could see is that while there still is an element of being truthful and factual, the main goal is to persuade. And so it definitely, you have to approach this as let's just say you cannot assume everything is truthful or factual with these types of documentaries, because the person has an agenda. It's like the propaganda films, but it's not coming from a government. It's coming from individuals or corporations or groups or whatever. They're trying to persuade you to change your behavior, to challenge a social injustice, to expose a corruption, to get that fixed. And many times they're willing to bend the truth or focus only on the horrible things to get people to support that, right? Now, another aspect now this one is not necessarily always a type But some technique that is used in documentaries, which are interviews, and interviews play, so like there's not like an interview type of documentary. There are lots of documentaries though that use interviews, and there are definitely some documentaries that use mostly interviews. For example, in The Social Dilemma, they use a lot of interviews from Silicon Valley because they wanted the experts that helped create a lot of that tech share their experiences and understanding with that, so that you knew what was going on. But the idea with interviews is that usually with interviews, right, it can be first-person experience. So if you're just, it doesn't have to always be experts. Like if you're interviewing people that were present at an event, right, they're going to share their experiences and stuff. Because that can be an important part. But a lot of times the interviews are about experts on specific subject matter that your documentary is about, so that they can, share their knowledge and experience with that. They often look like they're speaking off camera, so that or they're on camera, but they're speaking to someone off camera, which is usually what happens. The filmmaker is off to the side, and you don't see them. What this means is you only see the person being interviewed. Now, there's lots of ways to do this. This is not the only one. This is the most common. They also usually edit out the questions. And this will get us into other types of how the filmmaker engages with a documentary. If the filmmaker wants to be like participatory, you'll hear them ask the questions, or you'll even see them. But a lot of documentaries, the filmmaker is not like physical, like you don't know that they're there, other than that they made it and stuff like that. There you tend to do a lot of close-ups. And it's meant to the other thing that they tend to do is show B-roll while the expert is talking. So B-roll is just film that's been things that have been filmed of scenes, right? So like if you're talking about, let's say, the iPhone, well, then you take your camera and you'll shoot the iPhone from different angles, from different scenes, you swooping in, zooming in and out. And then when the person is talking, let's say from Apple about iPhone, you would show that B-roll, which is just of that. It can be of people walking down the street. The news stations show B-roll all the time. They film a bunch of things of people just walking on the street or having fun at an event that then they can showcase with that. So what's crazy about this is, let's look at this. There are lots of different angles on how to interview. So this is one of the more common ways here, right? So you've got the cameras, but the only person you're seeing is the person being interviewed. And you can see she's not looking directly at the camera. And she's looking off to the side because probably this person over here is asking the questions. And then they're getting the film from here, so it's almost at an angle. This is one of the easiest to make look good, and the most common method of how people are interviewed. The other one is like directly on camera, where you have the subject look into the camera, right? That one's meant to be a little more intimate. So you have the ones where like it's more artistic, and then you have the one that's meant to be more intimate, like they're talking to you, the viewer, because they're looking directly into the lens instead. Now another type, and this is the more participatory one, is where you see both the person being interviewed, right, the expert, let's say, I don't know, I'm just putting it next to these people randomly here, and then the filmmaker, right? And now in this case, you see both, right? So the filmmaker has put themselves into the film. This will be what we talk about with participatory documentaries. The filmmaker, now we see, and when we're watching this, we see the filmmaker interviewing. So you hear him ask the questions, you see them interact with the subject. And this one's meant to also sometimes be more intimate, like that they're just having a conversation. You can even make this less formal by being like in a diner. So instead of this setup is still very formal, but you could create the interview experience of like going to a diner and talking with a friend, talking with a friend on a couch in a house, right? It depends on how you want to set the scene for how formal or not formal. This one's just an animated thing that showcases how they do, where they have them at an angle looking off to the side of the camera while the camera is shooting. And this again is a very standardized interview technique that they do. So here's another one. This one's actually looking more directly at the camera, not fully straight on, but closer. And again, the filmmaker is behind the camera asking the questions while the person talks, but when we view it, we're only going to see the person answering the questions. And then another way is a 2-camera interview, sometimes even more than that. And this one's meant to showcase, right? When you're in editing, then you can flip back and forth between the 2 camera views, and that's going to give you a more dynamic engagement with the interview. And it plays into how we do stuff. So like when you're watching documentaries, like even The Social Dilemma and Super Size Me, look at how they do the interviews. What are the angles that they're setting up? How does that make you feel? Does it make you feel like more connected with someone that's looking directly into the camera versus if they're being more dynamic and moving back around? Does that create more interest? Is it helpful if there is like B-roll or animation is the other thing of The Social Dilemma does all these things, right? The Social Dilemma has animations. They have not reenactments. That's more with a historical thing. They have like the fictional story inside to highlight their point. So you have the experts talking with all these different interview techniques. You have maps and statistics, not maps, but you have statistics and charts and things like that, and data. And then you have the fictional story inside the documentary to highlight. They're trying to showcase this idea of what social media addiction does to a person. And so that's what that whole story and imagined brain with the 3 guys are doing. They're trying to say, this is what your brain does. But that's obviously not real, right? That's the fictional part that they create. And then they have animation scenes sometimes too with stuff. So they have all these different systems and setups that they're using to highlight that. And of course, you don't have the filmmakers in it. It's all just the people that are the experts, and then the fictional components and the B-roll and all those other things. But they use a lot of different techniques in The Social Dilemma. Whereas we'll see Super Size Me is not just participatory, but the idea is that it's not just that Morgan Spurlock, who created it, participates where we see him in the interview, but it's performative. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, is about the emotion that he experiences because he's doing that to his body, right? And so that becomes the center of Super Size Me, where that's not in The Social Dilemma. But the 2 scenes can make it more dynamic. So if you pay attention to how they're being interviewed, and whether that creates any response by you on, believability, authenticity, any of those things. And then of course the narrator is also important with that. The narrator can be like the voice of God, where it's spoken directly to the viewer, outside of the film, right? You only hear their voice and the narrator seems to know everything. Or you can have the narrator look at the camera and narrate the documentary where you see them, right? That's not the voice of God. The voice of God is the disembodied voice. Morgan Freeman, again, that's why I picked him. He is the best at that because his voice is so perfect for it. Everyone tries to get him for this. And then we have reenactments. Now, I mentioned in The Social Dilemma, they have that fictional scene in there, but that's not a reenactment. Reenactments obviously are not real either. Like they did not go to the Civil War and film, they didn't time travel back to the Civil War and film this battle. But they want to show it so that it brings it to life. Well, one of the ways you can do that is do these reenactments where it's actors and they're doing a scene, but it's not fictional because it's based on actual events. So, here, let's put it here. Reenactments. These, again, tend to be with historical documentaries, because you're recreating events that, if it's recreating events that happened in the past. Okay, and it's meant to bring the event to life. It's meant to make it more real. I mean, some of it is more interesting, right? It's meant to create a connection, right? So that you can imagine that battle actually happening and how it impacted people. And that, of course, the reenactments then tend to try to make sure that they're historically accurate. Most of the time, there are some that don't, but usually the goal is to be historically accurate, not just with the event, but the clothing, behaviors, all settings and stuff like that. It's all meant to pretend like it's like a film, a narrative film, like it's transporting us back to that time. Okay. And then with any of these, you can have like text and graphics, which we kind of talked about, or any type of reenactments also often use that coincide with that acted part is archival material. So one of the things you'll see is that it will mix in actual footage or film or audio with the reenactment, if they can. Right, that is one way to do it. So, and sometimes you just have it that, like, if you aren't doing reenactments, there are documentaries with World War II that just show all archival film and radio and audio and photographs. And then there's a narrator that talks about it, and there's no reenactment. But in a lot of the reenactments, you have archival material in there as well for part of it. Okay, so that's the reenactment. Again, usually it's reserved for historical types of things. There can be animation too. Text and graphics, anything that fits into that as well. And then and you have also let's put the last two here. So expository. Whoop. An expository is meant to inform and teach too. It's more engaging. I'm not gonna put a lot for this one. Right? Basically, this is meant to teach, or inform, and maybe even more inform than teach on a specific topic. You usually have an authoritative narrator to make it feel more legitimate, if you will. They try to use a lot of techniques, many techniques, to like graphs, text, B-roll, things like that, in order to make it seem legitimate. It's just a more, the thing of the instructional is like more how-to, and expository being more in-depth look at some type of thing. Any of like the nature films, right, would fit, documentaries would fit into expository. Let me put that, nature documentaries. Okay, and then observational. Observational is literally that. You're meant to immerse the viewer in the content. So it really is just about basically the camera is like someone observing the scene, right? So what you basically rely on B-roll, mostly B-roll. There is usually no narration or interviews. You can have music that complements it. Little to no text either on the screen. It's meant to just, this is what I filmed, and this is what you see. Although again, like I said, you can have music that will often become part of that. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do the last part with the filmmaker's involvement, and we'll do the experimental films for next time because it's already longer. I am always longer than I want to be. So we'll save the experimental film. We'll just pick up on that next lecture. Okay, so this is the last part. Then when we'll do experimental film next time, and filmmakers' involvement. So you have, I'm just going to write them up here and then talk about them real quick because again we're way out of time here. Participatory. You also have performative, and then the last one is reflexive. Yeah, reflexive. Okay, so the best way I will put this part, you see the filmmaker and engages with people. Performative is participatory, but also there is an emotional connection to it. Reflexive challenges the documentary style. That's in short, but I'm going to show you here, okay, because that doesn't always explain it fully. So a good example, and again, Super Size Me is both participatory and performative, because you see Morgan Spurlock performing and engaging and asking questions with the doctors, with the experts, but he's also emotionally invested in it. But a good one that's just participatory is Eileen, the selling of a serial killer. And basically participatory, you see the filmmaker engage with people. And in some cases you could argue that they're shaping the documentary because of how they're engaging. And one of the arguments for not doing it this way and being the just having a narrator and never seeing the filmmaker is that there are people who argue that the more pure, true form of documentaries is going to be those who don't shape it. They film, and what comes as it may is what you showcase. You may still edit it to create the narrative, but you're not, I don't know if you want to say corrupting it, but you're not guiding it in a certain way. But with participatory, if you have the filmmaker getting involved with the subjects that they're interviewing, then they're more likely to shape it a certain way based on their relationship with these people. And so that's kind of the sometimes, I guess, controversy or just discussion about what is better, because there's definitely arguments about how much the filmmaker should be involved in a documentary. For the participatory ones, and like Eileen, she directly talks to the filmmaker, and she actually gets frustrated and is like, screw this, I'm done, and hands him her mic. She looks visibly frustrated at one point, looking to him to help. You see him talking with her, right? That's that participatory component. Then you have the performative with Super Size Me, where again, he's also participatory. We see him interviewing the doctor that he's going to see and other people, and we see him in those interviews and discussions. However, he's also the main subject, right? This wasn't as unique. Super Size Me is unique because it was one of the first documentaries to do like a 30-day challenge kind of thing, right? This was set over 30 days. And it was specifically meant, he was the subject, his body was the subject of this documentary, to see how eating McDonald's all for 30 days impacted his health and his mental well-being. And he is emotionally invested in this. He gets sick from eating McDonald's all that time, and just in over a general reaction, like to having to eat it. But then he also, his blood pressure goes up. They talk about his heart and his liver, like, so he puts himself in physical danger by doing this experiment, is basically on himself, to film the documentary. That's that performative part, where there is now the emotional, active engagement of the filmmaker being part of the film, not just seeing him interviewing, but he is almost a subject. He is the only subject, essentially, minus the few people he interviews and stuff, but it's all centered around him. It doesn't have to be this immersive of performative, but it's that shift is when the filmmaker it's not just about seeing the filmmaker talk and engage with other people, but he is also part of the story, or she is part of the story. Then that shifts to performative. And then you have reflexive. Reflexive is, again, there's several different types of reflexive. Usually reflexive is challenging the what people think of documentaries. They push the boundaries of the documentary form. And this can come in several different ways. Some of it is that the way that you, like, the documentary process becomes part of the film itself. It also, often reflexive ones aren't as neutral or attempting to pretend to be factual as other documentaries. Then they don't hide that. We're showing it from this case. So Inventing Anna is a series, right? This one isn't just one film, it was a mini series and stuff, but it's one of the best examples of reflexive documentaries for this style. When this opens up each time with each of the mini series that's filmed, and this is about Anna Delvey, who pretended to be an heiress and conned all these wealthy people for quite a long time, and took loans out, like $1 million loans from these banks, and didn't pay anyone back, just scammed everyone. But at the beginning of each of this series, it says this whole story is completely true, except for all the parts that are totally made up. Right? So right there, they're saying this is a documentary, and what we are showing is true, except for what is not. So they're playing with that idea of a documentary and truthfulness, and part of that is being clever with the fact that she constantly was not true. She claimed all these things were part of her life, and it was all made up. So they're doing a play on Anna Delvey just with that. But then it's playing with the whole notion of a documentary, because now they're telling you straight up from the start. They're not hiding it. They're not pretending that everything is factual and truthful to the best of their knowledge in this documentary of her life. They're telling you straight up. Now, they're also having actors here, right? That they use, like, kind of, this is basically like the reenactment, but it's also more fictional and narrative than other documentaries. So that's where this one, right, it pushes the boundaries. Is this really a documentary? Some would say no, right? So others would say, yeah, barely, or it's a different type, or it's a hybrid of something in between. So there you go. Okay. Again, always, it's, I always take too long. So again, this was meant to include experimental movies as well. That's fine, because we're going to talk about genres next week, and we'll just include experimental movies at the beginning of next week along with the genres. And I think we'll be okay. It will be similar to what the times have been almost every week anyway. So we'll stop there. Again, with Super Size Me and Social Dilemma, really pay attention as you're watching those to how they do the documentaries differently, because they are very different in many, many ways. And their goal, their approach, you know, how they're addressing the topic. And you know, one of the big questions was asking, is one more effective than the other, right? Are there different methods and techniques that are being used in the social dilemma that makes it more impactful and interesting and engaging, or convincing? Or is there something in Super Size Me that is more engaging? And you could say you could have stuff for both, where you're like, well, in Super Size Me, this worked really, really well, and this technique, and they don't use that in Social Dilemma. But in Social Dilemma, when they do this technique, this was really useful. You know, there's more interviews with experts in Social Dilemma. They definitely come off as a lot more fact-based, where the Super Size Me is the fact-based stuff of the science and medical aspects of how it's impacting him, as well as information about the fast food industry. So you have that informative component, but you also get a whole lot more about his personal journey and experience in trying to eat McDonald's for 30 days versus the Social Dilemma, trying to look more at how it's impacting everyone, and kids, especially teenagers, and the dangers of social media on our brains. So okay, I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick up next week with the experimental films.